Okay, we're talking about history of slavery overview. The first thing that you need to know is that slavery has existed in every powerful empire that came before the United States. So we're going to talk about a few examples and how those societies definitely enacted slavery in this super short form. So in ancient Greece, slavery was present from 900 AD to 1975 AD. Oh, sorry, that was in West Africa. Sorry. Greece was 1200 BC to 323 AD. The Greeks enslaved others as they found the world's first democracies. Slaves were made of war captives, victims of piracy, and the unfortunate family members of those deep in debt. They worked throughout Greek society, from wealthy households and sacred temples to farms and mines. Greek law gave slave owners most complete power over their slaves, allowing any type of punishment except death. Slaves had no rights in court of law. A slave could buy his own freedom or receive it as a gift for outstanding service, but an ex-slave could almost never become a Greek citizen. Okay, so now we're talking about ancient China and their way that they enslaved people. One of the oldest civilizations, China, has a long history of slavery. Slaves were made of war captives and kidnapping victims. People also sold themselves into slavery to satisfy debts. So some sold their wives and children instead. Slaves worked as household servants in agriculture and construction and as government bureaucrats. Some families adopted their slaves. In some cases, slaves were even inherited wealth from their masters. The ruler Wang Mang abolished slavery in China in 17 AD, but it was restored when he lost power 6 years later. Slavery was not officially abolished until 1910 in the AD. Okay, in ancient Rome, millions of people were enslaved throughout Rome's territory. Most were war captives or kidnapped and lootings. At times, slaves outnumbered freemen to 3 times over. Roman law treated slaves brutally. Slaves could not possess property, enter into contracts, or marry. If a slave owner died violently within his own house, his slaves could be executed because they had not prevented his death. However, a slave was permitted to buy his freedom and become a Roman citizen. Such brutal treatment infuriated the slaves. Since slaves usually greatly outnumbered their owners, they often revolted. The most famous slave revolt was led by Spartacus. His army of 90,000 defeated 2 Roman armies before he was killed in battle, and thousands of his soldiers were captured and crucified. Okay, moving over to West Africa. African slavery arose long before Europeans came to the region in search of slaves, but West African slavery was quite different than what developed in Europe and the Americas. In many West African societies, land was owned by communities, not individuals. Social status and class could not be passed on to land ownership. Instead, they were based on one's place in social environment. Slaves were thus part of the family as well as private property. Slavery was not a lifetime status. Sometimes might be born free, made a slave for a few years, and then be free again for the rest of their life. Slaves had many rights. They could marry, own property, inherit substantial goods from their owner. They could even own slaves themselves. Their children were generally born into freedom, not servitude. Some owners even adopted their slaves as family. Typically, slaves were made of war captives, criminals, and people in debt. But the great demand for slaves in America required new ways to enslave Africans. Soon, slave traders turned to outright kidnapping and armed raids. These methods provided a steady supply of Africans to the slave market into Americas, which leads us to slavery in the United States. The trade route to the Americas began in 1632 and looked a little bit similar to this, although it was more also of a circle and pretty complicated. The Middle Passage was a brutal passage between Africa and the Americas in which people traveled in awful conditions. This one was absolutely even worse than it looks like in this picture. They were super crowded. People were crowded together. They were chained to each other. They had to go to the bathroom on themselves, and it was just an absolute horrendous experience. Slavery in the United States began in the 1400s. Because Europeans began enslaving Africans in the 1400s. For nearly a century, African slaves and European indentured servants lived in similar lives of drudgery. But servants earned their freedom in exchange for several years of work. Gradually, slaves lost their rights until they became property. The law gave masters total power over slaves, including the right to kill their slaves. Also, Euro-American and European slave owners thought they were superior to Africans, which increased the gap between slave and free. Opportunities for most enslaved African Americans to attain their freedom were few to none. So, European Americans and Europeans enslaved Africans, and they also enslaved Native Americans, and it was an absolutely brutal life. So, some common terms that we will use, we'll try to use the word enslaved person because they were human beings. An African American refers to an American whose ancestors were from Africa. To impress a person is to take away power, and to empower somebody is to give power. The Founding Fathers, which is the U.S.'s first political leaders, did not deal with the issue of slavery in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. Black codes were laws that existed in all states that prevented slaves from being treated as equal citizens. In some free states, free African Americans had to pay a fee and sign a contract to be able to move in. Some common myths about slavery in the United States. First one is that all African Americans before the Civil War were slaves. Not only were there free African Americans, but according to the U.S. Census of 1830, free African Americans also owned more than 10,000 slaves in Louisiana, Maryland, South Carolina, and Virginia. The majority of them lived on Louisiana sugar plantations. This was a way that they were trying to get their own money. I know this sounds really shocking, but this was something that we need to understand. The second myth is that all Southerners were pro-slavery. There were some Southern abolitionists who believed that slavery should be illegal. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were South Carolina daughters of a slave-owning family who spoke out against the U.S. against slavery. They're just two examples. Myth: all other Northerners were against slavery. Even after the American Revolution, most northern colonies were still slaveholding societies. In 1790, 15% of Delaware's population were slaves, and over 6% of New York and New Jersey were slaves. Also, Northerners depended on the super cheap cotton in the South. So even after there was abolished slavery in states like Delaware and New York, if you were a factory owner or a factory worker, your job depended on the fact that there was these slaves picking your cotton, and you could earn a ton of money if you were a factory owner because there was the super cheap cotton. And you were also told, if you were a factory worker, that if slavery ended, that your job would be done and their factory owners wouldn't have enough money to pay you. Since you didn't know any better and you didn't really understand how the system worked, you definitely believed them. And that led to a lot of Americans in the North who were pro-slavery. They also feared that if slavery ended, the slaves, ex-slaves, would come up to the North and take all of these immigrants' jobs. Also, another myth is that people who were anti-slavery meant being for racial equality. Very few, only the hardcore abolitionists, believed in equal rights for African Americans. Most anti-slavery Euro-Americans thought that freed slaves should be shipped to a colony in Africa or on an island, or still just not treated as equal, maybe not equal pay, not equal access to things. Another myth is that slaves were not intelligent. The fact is, Africans from various tribes were mixed up on purpose so there would be lack of communication. Learning to read and write was forbidden on almost every plantation. Slaves had to create their own form of English from what they heard. Lincoln single-handedly freed the slaves. The fact is that African Americans, free and enslaved, white, Euro-American abolitionists participated in a chain of events that eventually led to a widespread awareness that slavery should be abolished. Frederick Douglass also did a lot of advocating directly to Abraham Lincoln in order to get him to end slavery. Without all of this super hard work with people that we will be studying, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, John Brown, Dred Scott, and those are just a tiny number of the examples. Without all of them and all of their other people, the emancipation or the end of slavery would not have been possible. And that's it for our presentation on the history of slavery.